Kia ora koutou. Thanks very much for that introduction. As I said, I'm Joe Mills. I'm an archaeologist and historic heritage specialist working in the heritage unit at Auckland Council. I've been in this role for a number of years now, and a key part of this role is historic cemeteries. More recently, we've also been investigating new and emerging technologies for enabling better recording and preservation of these assets, particularly the physical parts of cemeteries. Not so much the biographical data, but the physical assets. Before we begin, I have a small confession. I've titled this talk Digital Recording of Cemeteries, but in reality, we'll only be looking at one methodology, and that's photogrammetry. So photogrammetry, just sticking to photogrammetry. We'll touch on some others, but it'll be largely photogrammetry. On that note, I'm by no means an expert in photogrammetry. I am largely self-taught. So if you have any curly questions, I might be at the limit of my technical expertise, but we'll see how we go. And then a final disclaimer before we actually begin. This talk will have images and descriptions of graves and cemeteries in various states of disrepair. So if you're particularly sensitive to that, you might find it upsetting. Probably best to skip this talk. So let's crack on. So as a bit of an overview, this talk is just going to be a wild ride through the world of cemeteries and digital recording. We're going to go all over the show, so bear with me. I've structured the talk around a series of questions, and I hope by answering these questions, we'll build to a larger point about digital recording in cemeteries. We'll begin by looking at why we should record cemeteries in general, why we should use digital methods. We'll look at photogrammetry, what it is and how it works, what you can do with the results, how we in the heritage unit are using photogrammetry, and then finally, how you all can get involved. So why record cemeteries? In 2018/19, I carried out a condition survey of all of the historic cemeteries in the Auckland region that Auckland Council owned or administered. I say all, we didn't quite manage to get to all of them, but we got to a majority of them. In total, we surveyed 41 cemeteries, so going from all the way to the very top of the region, past Wellsford, down to the very south of the region, Waiuku, up Awhitu Peninsula, and out to Tāpapakanga in the east. We did visit Waiheke Island, and we surveyed 2 cemeteries out there, but they weren't included as part of this larger piece of work. And we didn't manage to get out to Great Barrier Island, unfortunately, but hopefully in the future. I'm going to share some of the results of that survey to hopefully paint a bit of a picture about why we should record cemeteries. So this pie graph, hopefully you can read it. It shows what we determined the condition of the cemeteries in general were. So about a third of the cemeteries are in good condition, what we would expect, well, better than what we would expect for a historic cemetery, so slightly better than what you'd expect. Another third were average, above average, so kind of what you would expect for a historic cemetery, showing its age a little bit. The last third, more or less, were cemeteries where they were falling below what we would expect for a historic cemetery. So a little bit worse than what you would expect. These are rough kind of qualitative groupings, but that was just our useful heuristic for trying to figure out what's in what state, essentially. We also looked at the rate of deterioration. That's probably pretty difficult to see, but roughly 70% of the cemeteries had a slow rate of deterioration, so about what you'd expect, again. 23% had a moderate rate of deterioration, a little bit quicker than we would like. What I'm really concerned about is that 3%, that rapid category. And that probably only represents 1 or 2 cemeteries. But that's particularly concerning for us because rapid we take to mean that within maybe 5 or 10 years, there'll be severe adverse effects on that cemetery. And that's quite concerning. So further results. At 85% of all cemeteries, vegetation was a primary or secondary threat. This was largely vegetation growth in and around graves or in and between graves. This image, if you can make it out, is actually quite an extreme example of this. This is at O'Neill's Point Cemetery, where we have a large Mahuta tree that's grown through this grave. So vegetation growth was an issue. We also observed sorry, let me catch up. Root invasion was another impact that we observed. So where vegetation is growing near to graves, but not necessarily on graves, where the root systems are having an impact on the grave. Vegetation cover, where graves are being obscured by unchecked vegetation growth, where they can't be observed. And tree falls, where trees are either in the process of or having recently fallen on or near graves. At 78% of all cemeteries, erosion was a primary or secondary threat. This was largely subsidence. If you're familiar at all with cemeteries in Auckland, they're not in the best location a lot of the time. They're on steep topography, steep slopes, and as far as I know, it's very difficult to stop gravity. Things like to move downhill. So we noticed wide-scale subsidence. Things keep moving downhill. This image is from Simon Street Cemetery, again, a cemetery of steep topography. And this is a particularly large monument that is starting to slip down the hill a little bit. It's a very large monument. We also noticed localized subsidence, so what's commonly or colloquially referred to as coffin collapse, but more accurately is where grave cuts are collapsing in on themselves, so soft soil collapsing in. And that results in adverse effects for the furniture on top of the grave, so ledges cracking, headstones tilting or falling over, generalized instability. A really interesting result that we didn't expect was rabbit burrowing, particularly in our rural cemeteries. For whatever reason, rabbits really love burrowing in and around graves. Quite unfortunate. That has a cumulative effect of introducing more localized subsidence, so general collapse. And we also noted coastal and fluvial erosion for cemeteries that were in those areas. At 93% of all cemeteries, management and maintenance was a primary or secondary threat. We determined or defined management and maintenance as any intervention by council that has an adverse effect on the cemetery. The majority of this was lawn mowing. A lot of our cemeteries are managed as lawn cemeteries, whether they're intended to be or not. So they are mown frequently. And on occasion, the lawnmowers don't do a great job. They might be a little bit lax. In this image, it might be difficult to tell, but those are tire tracks from a ride-on mower that is ridden over the top of a grave. Some people argue that graves like this are designed to be ridden over. I would argue that putting anything large and heavy on top of a grave of this age is only going to result in adverse effects. Weed whacking was also a problem where we're weed whacking close to fragile graves, where essentially the weed whacking is knocking into soft concrete, soft stone, and creating those lovely incised lines that you might notice around graves. And then deferred vegetation management is another issue. So in the course of writing this talk, something really unfortunate happened, but I thought was also illustrative of a larger point to do with why we should record cemeteries. Queenstown Cemetery in September. So Queenstown experienced a severe adverse weather event with torrential rainfall, localized flooding, slips and subsidence. This instance happened at Queenstown Cemetery. We had forestry slash carried by a large landslide that wiped through about a third of the cemetery. I don't have firsthand knowledge of the impacts on the cemetery, of only going off what I've seen in the media, but it's difficult to imagine that there weren't any impacts on the cemetery from this event. It's also covered widely in the media. So about a third of Queenstown Cemetery affected by debris, Queenstown Cemetery damaged by flooding, Queenstown Cemetery buried by debris after severe weather event. This to me is illustrative of a larger point and something that I think is going to be more common as we experience more and more weather events, severe adverse weather events, is that heritage is going to be adversely impacted. This will probably be the new norm. This is lending to the urgency of why we should record cemeteries. Thankfully, in the last couple of weeks, Queenstown Lakes District Council have put out a great set of information about the restoration plan for the cemetery. This is awesome to see. It's really nice. It's a full 6-step process, but I'd like to draw your attention to this last point here, second to last point, which is detailed cleaning of the site and monument restoration. That part of the work can be particularly difficult if we don't know what the cemetery was like before, if we don't have records of how the headstones were or the condition that they were in. So I'd like to see almost a 0.1 at the very start of this, that is detailed recording of the cemetery to enable conservation and repairs. It's aspirational. So summing up, why record cemeteries? They are vulnerable. They're extremely vulnerable spaces. As I've hopefully demonstrated, there's a lot of impacts on them. They're also just very old spaces that weren't designed to, well, they were designed to last this long, but they're getting to the end of their shelf life. Cemeteries often fall through the cracks when we think of heritage. Kind of my own personal opinion. When we talk about heritage, we often refer to heritage buildings or significant archaeological sites. Cemeteries, for whatever reason, don't quite fit. Personally, I think it's because a lot of our cemeteries are living spaces. People are still interred in them. Even if they're historic, people are often still interred in them. So they're not quite heritage in some respect for some people. The tools that we have at our disposal to limit those adverse effects are somewhat limited. The main one is financial. It is very expensive to do ongoing work, stopping adverse impacts on cemeteries. Conservation, actual conservation, which is extending the life of a particular grave or a headstone, not just repairing it, is extremely expensive, necessarily so, because we want the best outcomes for that headstone. Some of the issues we simply can't solve. Subsidence without major geotechnical interventions, which has its own impacts on cemeteries. Without that, we can't stop subsidence, for example. Vegetation growth we can manage, but at the scale that it is impacting our cemeteries, it's a massive undertaking. And there's some complications about how vegetation also fits within cemeteries. Kind of to sum up, cemeteries have high significance and complex values, so many more values than just heritage values. They're places of religious significance, community significance, personal significance. They're really important places, but they are at high risk. We're kind of fighting a losing battle. So recording, in my view, is the very least we can do. We are not going to have cemeteries forever, but at least we can have records. So why digital recording? Traditional recording looks a little bit like this. This is Find a Grave, a screenshot from Find a Grave. I love Find a Grave. It is an excellent resource. I probably use it on a weekly basis. It's amazing. And it's a really useful resource. So it is a platform where volunteers can contribute information about headstones and cemeteries to build a kind of database of information about these places. And this is a really great record. We have the biographical information up there. We have information on the inscription. We have family relations. In this case, we even have the death certificate. And we also have a tiny little extract from Papers Past about the passing of this individual. And this is great. The biographical information is great. The only point where I feel like it can be improved is the image. We're relying on a 2D image, and it does its job. It shows you what the headstone looks like, and it can help you find this headstone in the cemetery. But the data contained within that image doesn't quite match the rest of this, this entry. We have a whole lot of biographical information, but not a lot of information on the headstone itself. And that's where I think digital recording comes in. So traditional recording can sometimes be limited in data capture, specifically for the headstone itself. We rely on two-dimensional imagery. Digital methods, in this case, I'm going to be talking about photogrammetry, are capable of capturing much more data than traditional methods in a relatively quick and easy manner. The outputs of digital recording, in this case, 3D modeling via photogrammetry, are easy to distribute and intuitive. Once we have the models, they can be made available to people, typically online, uploaded into a digital repository. This, I think, is the most important part, in that the outputs increase the visibility and accessibility of the records for many stakeholders that may normally miss out. So in this instance, I'm thinking of perhaps individuals who have moved overseas and they are not able to get back to their family cemetery, their family plot. They don't have up-to-date information on the state of the plot, or maybe they've got some photos, but it's difficult to use that to kind of maybe tell a story about your family or examine the family plot in any kind of meaningful way. I also think of people with limited mobility. A lot of our cemeteries are not accessible. They're very difficult to get around at the best of time. If you have limited mobility, it's almost impossible to get to a lot of these places. And for those people, they miss out. They can't access cemeteries in the way that other people can. By creating 3D models and hosting them online, people can then experience cemeteries, at least in some form. They're not barred from cemeteries by their mobility. Ultimately, digital recording is just a really powerful tool in our toolbox. It's a way to complement those amazing biographical records, that data that we have from Find the Grave, with information on the headstone itself. And in a lot of cemeteries, the headstones are the only things we really have left that are of meaning. So I've talked a lot about photogrammetry. What is it? It is simply a method for generating 3D imagery or 3D representations of the subject using 2D imagery. We make 3D models using photos. Photogrammetry is not necessarily a new technique. It's been around for quite a while. An early kind of form of photogrammetry that people might recognize stereo pairs, stereo imagery, where you're taking two slightly offset 2D images and viewing them through a stereoscope to get a 3D facsimile of whatever image you're viewing. This is kind of a version of photogrammetry in a way. We're taking 2D images and creating a 3D representation. Photogrammetry as a technique is widely used in a lot of different industries. It's not just a heritage thing. Although speaking of that, museums use it quite a lot to digitize their collections and make them accessible. Auckland Museum has done a really good job of this with their natural history material. They've put a lot of that online. They're also doing a great job with some of their heritage collections as well. A lot of institutions around the world are doing this work. It's commonly used in surveying, particularly using drones. So drones, top-down imagery, to build 3D models using photogrammetry as a way of visualizing the outputs in a different way. You're not just getting maps or top-down images, you're getting models. Commonly used in archaeology, I have to say this because I am an archaeologist. It's used in archaeology to create detailed digital records of a particular archaeological site or archaeological remains before they are damaged or destroyed or backfilled, for example. So we're creating a record that can be accessed later. A really interesting modern usage of it is in forensics. In this instance, we're looking at a car crash scene. So there's been a car crash. And while there's some urgency to clean up the scene and restore it back to operational, so cars can move again, that's happening. At the same time, a digital record is created so that later on, when we need to kind of interrogate the scene, investigate it a little bit more, we have a 3D record that can then be kind of moved around and examined. It's also commonly used in video game design and film and television with computer graphics. So how does it work? It sounds complicated, but it's surprisingly simple. You need a camera. You need a subject. You use that camera to take lots of high-resolution images of a subject. We try to surround the subject with photos, see it from all angles. You take all of those photos and you put them into a piece of photogrammetry software. The software works its magic. I could go into detail, but I won't. It works its magic, and you end up with results like this. So these are two models that I've generated a while ago. The one on the left is the grave of Nellie Rathborn at O'Neill's Point Cemetery. This model was made from about 50 photographs. I really love this little model. It's a small headstone. It's a beautiful little headstone. And it's obviously had a bit of a rough time. It's, elements are missing, it's shifted on its base. But with this record, we can repeat this modeling and we can see how it's changing over time. We can see if it's shifting more. We can see if it's stable or unstable. We can see where perhaps more elements are going missing. The lead lettering on the front is particularly vulnerable. It keeps kind of peeling off, and we can track that over time with this modeling. Grave on the right, you probably recognize it from Find a Grave. This is the Charlton grave. And we'll actually look at it in a little bit more detail. So these models are often hosted online. There's a platform called Sketchfab, which is a great option for this, where you can then move around the model and kind of interrogate it, ask questions of it. Usually I would just do this, I'd show you this, but we've had to pre-record. And this is the stone. This is the model, this is the headstone. And it's particularly useful because we have this nice big crack through the middle of it. It's obviously been repaired at some point. And we can look at that repair in a little bit more detail. We can kind of examine that repair. Maybe we can track if it needs further repairs in the future, if there's any structural issues with it. We've also got this great detail on the top of the stone. It's a really beautiful stone. And we've captured a lot of detail. What this model allows us to do is ask more questions of the stone. We can't, maybe we can't physically go there, but we can examine it in some form. We can interact with it. That's the power of photogrammetry, in my view. I need to catch up on my notes because I've just been talking non-stop. Apologies, almost there. Cool. So strengths and drawbacks of photogrammetry. It is relatively easy to do. These days, there are applications on your phone that you can download, and within minutes, you can start creating 3D models. It's really quite simple to do, and these apps will guide you through it. It's cheap, if not free. Some of those apps are free. Some of them have a very small subscription. It's relatively quick, so those previous models probably took me about 15, 20 minutes to create. 5 minutes at most to take all the photos, and then maybe another 10, 15 minutes to build the model in the software. And in that time, we've developed a really great detailed record of these headstones. The last point there, I think, is probably the most important, is that it enables community recording. It is so easy to do that anyone can do it. In the same way that Find a Grave is kind of built off the contributions of volunteers, volunteers can also do digital recording to create great records that can complement Find a Grave, for example. But there is some technical know-how required. If you want to get kind of more in-depth and maybe get better models, you might need to look at the way you're doing it. So you might need more than just your phone. You might need some external resources. But as I said, I'm self-taught. A lot of this information is available online. A lot of great YouTube videos that will tell you exactly how to do it. And you can do trial and error and just learn by doing. Scaling up can be expensive. For photogrammetry, you can do it with basically anything that you can photograph, more or less. So it's commonly used to record buildings. That's a little bit more difficult to do with just your phone. Some people do it, but scaling up requires more resources. So you might need a better camera. You might need a drone, something to take aerial photos. You might need a little bit more powerful software. You might need some hardware that will kind of push you over the line. So it can get a little bit more expensive, but it's still surprisingly affordable. The last point is probably a point I think about the most. And it's a question I get asked the most. What can you do with the results? We build these lovely models and we put them online. So what? Beyond actual recording, so what? To answer that question, I'm going to give you a couple of case studies. I'm going to go overseas for a little bit. So Burial Hill. This is courtesy of Becky from MCH. Shout out, Becky, if you're listening. This is a really great article about the Burial Hill digitization project in Plymouth, Massachusetts. A PhD student named Kerry Klein decided to undertake a recording program of one of the cemeteries in her local area, particularly significant cemetery, very old cemetery with some very significant burials and local settlers. She undertook this project to digitize as many of the headstones as possible. The headstones here are particularly old, particularly fragile. The stone that's used is quite soft, and a lot of the headstones are degrading. So some pull quotes. Klein sees digital archaeology as a vital tool in the present and future of public archaeology. Bringing important sites and heritage online makes them accessible to anyone with access on the internet. This harkens back to that earlier point that by creating these models and putting them online, people can now interact with that heritage in some form. They don't need to be local, you don't need to be in Massachusetts, you could be sitting at your computer at home and you can interact with these headstones. You can ask questions of these headstones. Klein also hopes her project will aid in preservation and conservation. Once gravestones are damaged or worn away, it's impossible to repair or replace them without a detailed record. This is probably the next most important point is these headstones are fragile. We need records of them, otherwise they will just go, and then we won't know anything about them. And she says that if a tree falls this winter and takes out 20 stones, if we have these models, then they can create a 100% accurate stone. So we can use this for conservation purposes. It's easier for conservators to fix things when they know what they were like. If we don't, then it's a lot more difficult, a lot more guesswork. But if these stones are destroyed and they can't be repaired or restored, at least we have a record of what they were like. There's a couple of the headstones. I think to date they've done about 95 headstones in a cemetery. I think they're about 700. They're aiming to get them all done. But they create these models and they pop them on Sketchfab, and now anyone can go and look at them. There's some really beautiful stones in that kind of digital collection. That's a kind of micro scale piece of work, specifically on cemeteries. But I think the possibilities are much larger. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, go macro level, and tell you about CyArk. It says CyArk behind that. CyArk standing for Cyber Archive. CyArk are a digital preservation company, organization. They're a non-profit based out of California. And their mission is to digitally preserve and curate heritage sites across the world. This is just a small snapshot of some of the places they have digitally recorded using a combination of methods with the aim of making them accessible to anyone all around the world. So you don't have to be at a place to experience its heritage. I'm going to talk about one example that you might have spotted there, and that's Waitangi. So in 2017, CyArk and Air New Zealand partnered up to digitally conserve the Waitangi Meeting House and the Waka House at Waitangi. They did this using a combination of laser scanning and photogrammetry. And they created an amazing record. Just a little GIF showing the interior of the meeting house. This is a really high resolution detailed digital record. It's amazing, it's beautiful. It's a really important resource. Beyond just making a version of this virtually using photogrammetry, they went a step further. Part of their mission is to promote heritage, not just show it, but promote it, get people involved. And so they created a virtual exhibition of the meeting house. This is narrated by the cultural manager for the Waitangi meeting ground. And you can walk around this space virtually and have things explained to you as a normal tour would. He's telling you about the whakapapa of the place. He's telling you about particular carvings. He's telling you about the history of the site. This is taking photogrammetry to the next level. It's making it an important cultural resource. This to me is the gold standard of what you can do with photogrammetry or 3D modeling. Taking it from just a recording exercise to something that enables increasing engagement with a particular site. I think Waitangi is important because it's our national place. And there's probably a lot of New Zealanders that won't get to Waitangi for whatever reason. At least they have a resource that they can access where they can experience it in some form, even if they can't get there physically. This is really important work. So what can you do with the results? Digital curation and conservation, so Burial Hill, digital preservation and storytelling with SciArc. Another couple of points here I probably don't have enough time to talk about, but open source model dissemination for public engagement. So that's taking open source models and putting them into new and interesting platforms. That stands for the Unreal Engine Fortnite program. So familiar with Fortnite, the gaming platform. It's taking models and putting it into Fortnite. It's a whole thing. It's really interesting. And 3D printing for restoration. If we have 3D models, usually we can 3D print them or print elements of them, which is really useful for restoration. And if I get a chance later, if someone wants to ask me a question about this, hint, hint, I'd love to talk more about it. So how are we using photogrammetry in our work in the Heritage Unit? It's just a tool in our toolbox at this stage. We don't have a set program for use, but we're using it where we can, where it's appropriate. So when we need to make quick, detailed records of particular places, or if we have a compliance issue, that's where we're using it. We're also working to support other organizations who are carrying out this kind of work. So if you're familiar with the Colonial Ammunition Company shot tower, that unfortunately had to be demolished earlier in the year due to the weather events we had. It was structurally unsound. We were approached in the Heritage Unit by colleagues from Unitec and Massey University who wanted to carry out digital recording on the shot tower before it was demolished. And we worked with them to get a great detailed record of the site. So now, despite the fact that the shot tower is literally scrap, we have a record of it that can be used for future interpretation or recreations. We have some other interesting ideas that we're exploring, and I'll show you an example of that now. So, Pakuranga Methodist Cemetery. I'd be surprised if many people have been to this cemetery. It is a lovely little slice of heritage in Pakuranga. So this cemetery, tiny little cemetery, this is the entirety of the cemetery. There originally was a chapel with this graveyard associated. The chapel was removed and taken to Howick Historical Village in the 70s. And we just have this cemetery left. And it is just off the main highway, literally on the main highway, surrounded by residential development. It's a tiny little pocket cemetery. It's lovely. It's really cute. I love it to bits. This is a model that I created, quite a few images, a few hundred images, trying to create a detailed record of the cemetery. It's a bit of an experiment. And we'll kind of move around the cemetery now. So this is on foot, just literally taking photos, taking photos, taking photos to build this model. What I like about this model is that it shows a lot of what we've already been talking about. Talk about that in a minute. We've got annotations on the individual headstones that we can use to add information. This one's got a link to another model of this individual headstone. We can add images. We can link to other resources like Find a Grave. We can turn this model into a learning tool or a biographical and digital record. This particular model is useful because it demonstrates some of those threats that I was talking about earlier. Right there, if we look, we have some tire tracks from inadvertent mowers. You've probably noticed a lot of the cracking from localized subsidence. This little blob in the corner that I'm about to point out, that's actually a tree root from a tree that was removed from this particular grave. More cracking. It's a really great little cemetery. It's actually in surprisingly good condition. It's had a lot of work done to it. Also that lovely fallen grave there, that fell in the last couple of years. What I like about this model is that on the site there's a very large tree. It's just down in the corner there. It's right next to the graves. If that tree were to fall over tomorrow, completely wipe out the cemetery, we might have a chance of restoring it in some form. But if we don't, at least we have this. It's a record. If the heritage is destroyed, we have something that we can look at and rely on, and maybe show future generations. That's the kind of work that I would like us as a unit to get to. We're still working on how we might make that happen, but this is the potential and how we're kind of pushing that. So how you can get involved. As I've said, it's quite simple. It's not too difficult to do. You can have a go at it yourself. There's freely available user-friendly software, app-based stuff on your phone that you can download and start working on. Polycam and Reality Scan are two really good options for that. Consider how photogrammetry can contribute to the work that you're carrying out. So I've had conversations with community groups about how they can incorporate photogrammetry into their work with their local cemeteries. Also spoken to sextons about how they are using photogrammetry to look after their at-risk graves in their cemeteries. It doesn't also have to be for cemeteries. It could be for anything or any kind of work, really. My final point is one I come back to a lot, is that recording data on heritage is never a waste of time. Heritage is a finite resource. We are losing more than we are making. Any records that we create are useful in some form or another. And digital recording, I think, is probably the way forward with a lot of this. It enables us to capture a lot of data really quickly, and we might not have a use for it now, but we'll probably have a use for it in the future. And that's why archives exist. So consider having a go. It's not too difficult.